Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another installment of Draco Sinister. So, this is another chapter that I had to kind of edit pretty extensively, just because, again, so much running around, so much nonsense going on that just really dragged our plot down. So, that is part number one. Part number two is a trigger warning for the top of this chapter. There is underage drinking. So if that is something that bothers you, then you might want to just maybe sit this one out. But without further ado, let us just get into it. Chapter 13. Through a Glass Darkly. When Ginny turned the time turner, Hermione felt the world vanish from under her feet, and everything spun away behind her eyes into grey mist. It was like using the time turner McGonagall had given Hermione in her third year, and yet not like it at all. She felt herself shot backward as if hurtled from a cannon, and could neither see nor feel anything beyond the heaving, freezing grey mist. She could feel Ron and Ginny's hands entwined with her own, and she gripped them with terrific force, and they gripped her hands in return. Suddenly, her vision fragmented, and for a split second she saw Harry, actually saw him, as clearly as if he stood before her. He was sitting with his back to a blue wall, his hands behind him, and he was covered in blood. No! She threw herself forward, calling out his name, just as the vision vanished, and she gasped out loud as the grey mist suddenly lifted, and she pitched forward, hard, slamming her hands into the ground. "Oh!" Hermione cried, her knees collapsing underneath her as the ground found her once more. For a moment, she just lay still, catching her breath, her eyes screwed shut. When she opened them up, the first thing she saw was the brilliant blue sky. Hurling herself into a sitting position, she blinked and stared around wildly. They were lying in a place that might once have been a small castle, but what now seemed to be reduced to a tumbled-down ruin. It looked like Mr. Weasley was right. The burrow was a castle once, only it was razed down to the foundations. Knowing that they were short on time, Hermione leapt to her feet and saw Ron and Ginny lying not too far away from her among the ruins, gazing around with equally rueful expressions. "Are you all right?" she whispered fiercely. "I'm okay," Ron affirmed in a low voice. "Landed just fine. For a second there I thought I'd dropped the invisibility cloak," he added, pulling the silvery cloak out of his pocket briefly and showing it to her before tucking it back in. "Gave me a horrid turn." So that's what he went to get, she thought idly. Then suddenly she glanced over to look at Ginny. She was staring around the battlements, and her face was very white, with an emotion Hermione couldn't read. It was no wonder. The structure around them had suffered a massive bout of destruction. Broken stones showed where there had once been walls, and smashed glass littered the churned earth, as did the trunks of trees, which looked as if they had been ripped from the ground, their roots clawing the sky. There was a shredded remnant of a tapestry, another wall supporting a staircase that ended abruptly in midair. The air carried the smell of burning wood, sticky pitch, and sharp, burning cedar. Hermione scanned the scene, but she barely had time to take it all in. Then, suddenly, Ron's voice cut into her thoughts. "What happened here?" he demanded. "It looks like Fred and George set off the world's biggest filibuster firecracker." "Aftermath of magical battle," said Hermione briefly, and shivered. "Must have been a hell of a battle," said Ron, looking impressed. "I've never seen anything so destroyed." Agreed Hermione. But before she could say more, another voice suddenly rang out. "Survivors!" Hermione glanced up and saw someone poised on a slant of overhanging rock above where she, Ron, and Ginny were standing. Instinctively, she stepped back, trying to push Ron and Ginny behind her. The sunlight was behind the person standing above them, so she could only see the outline of a robed wizard or witch staring down at them. "Are you all right down there?" the person shouted again. It was a boy's voice. "We're fine," Hermione called up, "but we're not survivors. I mean, not literally. Apparently, the boy decided that this claim merited further investigation, and in a space of a moment, he had leapt down from the rock and landed lightly on his feet in front of them, holding his wand. Hermione made a little gurgling sound in her throat and stared. It was Harry. Harry, who had been 11 the first time she'd seen him, small and skinny, his eyes the biggest feature of a face still round with the last vestiges of childhood. Only his eyes weren't green. He wore no glasses, and his forehead was unmarked. His wizarding robes were scarlet, although of a very archaic cut. "You're the heirs, aren't you?" he said with no trace of surprise. "I've been waiting for you." "Waiting for us?" Hermione echoed faintly, still staring. The boy who looked like Harry nodded. "There's not much time. You better come with me right away." "Not so fast," said Ron, trying to push Ginny and Hermione behind him. This was unsuccessful, since both resisted his efforts to be protective with indignant muttering noises. "Who are you? And why should we go anywhere with you?" "Ron," interrupted Ginny, pushing at his arm, "can't you see he looks just like Harry?" "And that automatically makes him trustworthy? If he was a dead ringer for Professor Snape, would you be following him home?" The boy was now looking at them with mild suspicion. "Who do I look like?" "A friend of ours," said Hermione, giving Ron's hand a warning rap with her knuckles. "Are you related to Godric Gryffindor?" The boy's face tightened. "Godric Gryffindor was my father." He looked at the girls and swept them a little bow. "My name is Benjamin." Ginny was impressed. "He bowed," she said, and looked at Hermione. "Guys never do that anymore." "I was raised to be polite to women," said Benjamin, glancing at them dubiously, "even if they are dressed like Muggle men." Ron was still looking at him suspiciously. "How do we know you are who you say you are?" The boy sighed and reached over his shoulder. He drew forth something that glimmered in the sharp sunlight. It was a sword in a scabbard of marred, dark silver, engraved all over with brilliant designs of flowers, animals, and leaves that flowed together intricately to form the word Gryffindor. The hilt of the sword was set with scarlet stones, which formed the shape of a lion head. Ginny sucked in her breath, looking at the hilt. "That's the sword of Gryffindor." "Yes," said Benjamin, and looked hard at her. "You're Helga's heir." She nodded. "I'm Ginny." "And you are the heir of Ravenclaw," he went on, looking at Hermione. Then his gaze slid to Ron. "Are you the heir of Gryffindor? I didn't think you'd be so—" "Red-headed?" put in Ginny with a mischievous smile. "I'm nobody's heir," said Ron, looking long-suffering. "Just some git along for the ride, apparently." Benjamin looked doubtful. "Did you mean it when you said we didn't have much time?" Hermione put in quickly. Benjamin's voice was short. "You don't. Rowena." His voice trailed off. "You'll see when we get to her." Then he swept his red cloak around himself and set off without looking back. Pausing only to glance and shrug at the others, Hermione followed him, Ginny and Ron behind her. Benjamin wended his way through the rubble as if it were a familiar landscape. Hermione scrambled to catch up and walk beside him. She was bursting with curiosity. "What happened here?" He looked at her incredulously, and Hermione couldn't repress a little shiver. It was bizarre to see such black eyes looking out of Harry's face. "The war," he said. "Between whom?" Hermione was fairly sure she knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. Skidding down a slope of tumbled rock and broken bits of stone, Benjamin shook his head. "The Snake Lord raised an army," he said. "He marched against the House of Wizards and against those who were once his friends. Don't you know all this? Isn't it like a history lesson for you?" "Humor me," said Hermione. The boy shrugged. "All right. The Snake Lord created an army of goblins, shapeshifters, and hybrid half-men creatures. The whole wizarding world was drawn into the battle." He paused and glanced around at the wreckage. This was Hufflepuff Castle. What wasn't burned to the ground by dragonfire was destroyed in the aftermath of the curse. "What curse?" Hermione demanded. "Rowena will explain it to you," said Benjamin as they came around a corner of a broken wall and out into the sunlight. Hermione gasped. The landscape was barely recognizable as that which surrounded the Barrow and Ottery St. Catchpole. Open fields stretched before them, as far as the eye could see, the blue sky arcing overhead. Dotting the field in clusters were hundreds, possibly thousands of wizarding tents, both large and small, and all the colors of the rainbow. Magical pennants snapped overhead in the brisk winter wind. She saw the scarlet of Gryffindor, the blue of Ravenclaw, and the gold of Hufflepuff. There was the firefly spark of campfires that glowed in between the tents, and she could see dozens of figures hurrying about, some clearly human, some clearly not. "Blimey!" exclaimed Ron from behind her, sounding impressed. "I've seen pictures of camps like these in textbooks from the Goblin Rebellions. Never thought I'd seen one in real life." On the way to the camp, they passed over the remains of what had been a moat and would one day be the Weasleys' quarry. Stone steps led down into it, and a thin layer of dirty water covered the bottom. Hermione couldn't help staring as they crossed over it on a thin plank of wood. Somewhere down there lay incalculable treasure, not to mention the time turner that would one day be Ginny's. Close up, the camp made for an even more bizarre sight. Hermione, Ron, and Ginny stuck close behind Benjamin as he wended his way through the tents, trying to ignore the odd looks they were getting. Hermione supposed they did look bizarre. She wished she had worn something other than her pajamas, but then she didn't have any 1,000-year-old wizarding robes lying around. Benjamin paused outside a small blue tent and murmured, "Wait here," to Hermione and the others before ducking inside. Ron reached over and rubbed Hermione's arms. "You look cold." "I am cold," she said. "It's freezing, and those dwarves are making me nervous." Ron glanced over at the little men in question, then turned back to Hermione with a tight smile. "I'm sure we don't need to worry about them. Sure, they're mean little buggers, but they're good fighters." "Yes, but when you get them drunk, they run around axing everyone's leg off at the knee," Hermione said stoutly. As if they had heard her, the dwarves glanced over and glared at the three of them out of many pairs of little red eyes. A moment later, they had gone back to singing louder and more raucously than before. "Our chimneys were dirty at Mrs. McFry's, and I'll grant they were worse down at Molly O'Clue's. But the chimney sweep said with a gleam in his eye, I've got a great tool here for cleaning the flues. For I may be a tiny chimney sweep with a tiny grimy face, but I'm carried a broom that makes strong girls weep. Won't you let me up your fireplace?" Benjamin poked his head out of the tent. "She said she wants to see the heirs," he said, looking at Hermione and Ginny. "Just the heirs," he added, looking at Ron. "You'll have to wait here." Hermione shook her head before Ron managed to say anything. "No, we won't go in without Ron." Benjamin stepped out of the tent, drawing the flap shut behind him. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice sharp with anger. "She's dying. She gave everything she had in defeating the Snake Lord, and it's killing her. She's only kept herself alive this long because she wanted to see you. She's been like a mother to me my whole life, and these past 2 days I've had to watch her suffer, so I'm sorry It seems like I don't like you, but as far as I'm concerned, you're the reason she's still here and in pain. And Benjamin, Hermione interrupted, shocked. I'm sorry. We didn't know. He nodded, obviously ashamed of his outburst. Hermione exchanged a quick glance with Ron and Ginny, who were both obviously taken aback as she was. I'll wait outside, said Ron quietly. It's fine. Benjamin nodded, an unhappy look around his eyes easing slightly. I'll wait with you. He turned back to the tent and pulled the flap back open for Hermione and Ginny, who hesitated a moment, then ducked through. Hermione paused at the entrance and looked back at Ron. He returned her anxious glance, blue eyes bright under his sooty hair, and winked. She bit her lip. Ron, be careful. Don't go anywhere, and don't get in a fight with the dwarves. I'm not going to get in a fight with the dwarves, Hermione. Get along with you. Hermione glanced over at Benjamin. Look after him, she said, ignoring Ron's glare, and quite conscious of how silly it sounded, telling a 12-year-old to look after a boy 4 years older. But she didn't care. With a last quelling glance at both of them, she ducked into the blue tent after Ginny. The inside of the tent, like the inside of many wizarding tents, was completely unlike the exterior. Hermione and Ginny found themselves in a beautifully appointed bedchamber with walls of stone. A fireplace stuck into the north wall smoked and spat with red gold fire. Tapestries and metal-bound chests caught the light and flared and faded in harmony. At the end of the room was a heavy-looking bed with the curtains drawn back, and on the bed, the darkly outlined shadow of a woman lying amid the pillows. Come closer, she said, and Hermione took Ginny's hand, and together they went towards the bed. As they approached, the shadows melted into clarity, and Hermione was able to see the woman more clearly. She sat up against a stack of pillows, wrapped in periwinkle blue robes, and had the tumble-down brown hair and peach-pale skin of her tapestried self back in Slytherin's castle, only without the ink stains on her cheek. Only she looked deathly tired as she leaned forward and reached out her hands towards the girls. So, there is another of me in the world now, she said gently, and another Helga, just as pretty as she was. Hermione and Ginny were both speechless. Please, sit down. You look cold, Rowena said, and gestured towards a low bench on the side of the bed, stacked with the same soft-looking pillows. Hermione nodded as they sat. It was summer where we were. When we were, she corrected herself. Rowena smiled tiredly at her, reached out, and touched the lycanthropy on the chain around Hermione's throat. I thought this was destroyed, she said. When Salazar went, it vanished along with him. I'm glad it found its way to you. Hermione drew the chain over her head and handed it to the older woman without the usual pang that accompanied giving it up even for a moment. It's yours, she said, not knowing exactly why she was doing it. Rowena smiled and held it lightly in her left hand before extending her other hand towards the girls. Pector Garamenentus, she said. A slight tingling sensation ran over Hermione, followed by a feeling of warmth. Glancing down, she saw that her pajamas had metamorphosed into long robes of soft, dark blue over a wool dress. She glanced over at Ginny, who was now wearing similar clothing of dark green and looking quite surprised. Hermione was impressed. Thank you, said Rowena, as if Hermione had been the one to do her a favor, and handed back the lycanthropy. Hermione looked from the silver object to the older witch. You're a Majid, she said. You shouldn't need the lycanthropy to do magic. But I'm dying, said Rowena softly. I expect Benjamin told you. I haven't got much strength left, but I wanted to do a little magic. I've missed it these past few days. Hermione cleared her throat, but her voice still came out squeaky as she said, Benjamin, he's the first heir of Gryffindor? Rowena nodded. He's very like Harry, Hermione continued in a rush, knowing that time was short. He's the heir of Gryffindor in our time. Where is this Harry? Rowena asked. I thought he would have come with you. Hermione wanted to answer, but her throat seemed to have closed up. Ginny reached over and squeezed her hand. Slytherin took him, she said finally. We don't know where. Where did he take him? Rowena said, paling even farther if that were possible. And how? Hermione related very quickly the story of her own experience being kidnapped by Slytherin, and then their encounter with him at the Barrow. When she was done, Rowena exhaled softly. He must have found a source, she said. Another Majid who was willing to align with him. When you first met him, he was weak and had only just risen, as I knew he would. So, he's strong again? Asked Ginny. Only temporarily, said Rowena. A source is meant to be used as an amplifier of power, a focusing device. A source is not to be relied upon to provide the magic a wizard lacks. Such a connection would drain the source and kill them slowly. He will need another source soon, and another, and another. Is that why he wants Harry? Hermione demanded numbly. No, he would not waste the heir of Gryffindor like that. And besides, a source must be willing. He knows it cannot last. He is propping up his powers for as long as he needs to find the orb. Ginny was bewildered. The orb? I stripped Slytherin of his powers before I imprisoned him, said Rowena a little breathlessly. I remember this, Hermione interjected swiftly. Rowena eyed her, curious. Hermione blushed and relayed the story of Draco dying and his encounter with her spirit in the grey spaces. When she was finished, the older witch looked even more tired and resigned. So, that is to be my fate. It is to be expected. But what my shadow self must not have had the time to tell your Draco was that the monster in question was... A manticore? Hermione cut in again, as a sudden flash of the creature engraved on the box that had held Ginny's time-turner became clearer to her now. Rowena nodded. The orb is hidden inside the manticore, which itself is immortal and impervious to most types of magic. It would have to be killed for someone to retrieve the orb from it. But he cannot kill the manticore, not weakened as he is. It is far too deadly. But if he did, said Hermione, if he did kill the manticore, and if he had the orb, then what? The orb can only be opened in the presence of all 4 heirs. Each must touch it and speak an opening charm, and they must do so by choice. Words spoken under the Imperious Curse would be ineffective. Does Slytherin know that? No, but he is clever. He knows me as well. Given time, he could work it out. So, he won't use Harry, said Ginny, looking visibly relieved. But Hermione remembered the image she had seen of Harry as they traveled through time, and suddenly she needed to know what that image meant. I have to tell you something, she began in a halting voice, and Rowena turned to regard her. When we used the turner, when we were in between time, I thought I saw Harry, just for a second. He was in a blue room. His arms were chained behind his back. But I didn't see Draco with him, she thought, but pushed the thought down. He's a Majid, said Rowena, sitting up. Then there is one prison on this earth that could hold him. Salazar built it himself as a means to hold me. Hermione's head was spinning. Harry is in an adamantine cell. Doesn't that mean it would be impossible to get to him? Getting into it now wouldn't be difficult, seeing how the castle is deserted. said Rowena thoughtfully. "In the future, though, Salazar may have changed the wards that will be able to get you out again. He is capable of much. Before I imprisoned him, he delighted in destroying whole armies at a blow, wiping them out with lightning, drowning them in sorcerer's floods. Once he made a whole army disappear without a trace." There was a rustle at the tent flap, and Benjamin poked his head in. Rowena smiled. "Eavesdropping, Ben?" "Not exactly," the other boy said, but Rowena was looking at him now with something akin to curiosity. "Is there someone out there with you?" she asked with great interest. "Well, yes, but I wasn't going to—" "No, let him come in," Rowena said, straightening up. With a puzzled glance, Ben stepped into the tent and held the flap open for Ron to follow him. Looking curiously around the inside of the tent, Ron hesitated a moment to take in the elaborate furnishings and the collection of weaponry hanging on the wall. "Let me look at you," said Rowena to him, and held out a hand. Looking even more curious, Ron obeyed. Hermione watched as he crossed the room to the bed, his hands shoved in his pockets, eyebrows raised. "You're a diviner," said Rowena without preamble, looking closely at him. Ron jerked his hands out of his pockets in astonishment. "A what?" "A diviner. A seventh son. Are they not common in your time?" Hermione felt her mouth drop open. "But Ron hates divination," she said, unknowingly repeating Sirius's words to the demon when he had told him much the same. But Rowena wasn't listening. Suddenly she reached up, drew his head down, and kissed him lightly on the forehead. "Be very careful," she said. "Swear that you will." Alarmed, Ron straightened up. I will. I promise." Rowena nodded. "Thank you," she said, and sat back against the pillows. "You may go now." Ron nodded uneasily. "Right." He backed up, nearly stumbling into Benjamin, who took his arm and steered him out of the tent, while Ron stared back over his shoulder until the tent flap closed behind them. Ginny wanted to ask why Ron needed to be careful, but Rowena had closed her eyes now as if exhausted, and she felt Hermione's eyes turn to her. "We should go," said Hermione gently. Impulsively, Ginny leaned forward and squeezed Rowena's hand. Then both girls rose and left the tent. Outside, the icy brilliance of the cold blue sky stung Ginny's eyes. She glanced around uneasily for Ron, and saw him almost immediately. As always, his flame-red hair marking him out like a beacon. He was sitting on a long wooden bench, talking animatedly to a large group of "Dealers," said Hermione, widening her eyes in surprise. "Here." "They've been hanging around since the Snake Lord was defeated," said Benjamin, who had come up silently behind them. "No one can seem to get them to go away." Hermione snorted. "Doesn't look like Ron's trying too hard either," she snapped. Ginny was inclined to agree. Ron looked as if he was having the time of his life, surrounded by beautiful girls who were all looking at him admiringly. His cheeks were bright red with cold, and he was gesturing animatedly as he talked, describing elaborate ideas in the air with his freckled hands. "He's probably telling them that he invented punctuation," Hermione added irritably. Benjamin widened his dark eyes. "You mean he isn't really the youngest Minister of Magic ever in your time?" Ginny chortled, while Hermione spluttered indignantly. "What? Ron? Honestly?" "Oh, come on, Hermione, it's harmless." Ginny grinned. "It is not," Hermione exclaimed, and poked Benjamin in the shoulder. "Go, retrieve him, would you?" Giving her a look that said clearly that he didn't think he should be the one to retrieve their friend, Benjamin trudged off towards Ron. Ginny giggled, but stopped when she realized that the other girl was still bristling all over like an angry cat. Hermione, really? She said, as diplomatically as she could. You can't fly off the handle every time any girl so much as looks at one of your boys, you know. Well, unless it's Harry. I do not... Hermione began indignantly, then stopped, and smiled ruefully. Oh, all right. It's just that... Well, it's Ron. He's my best friend, and he deserves better than some empty-headed Bela trollop. I just want him to have somebody as wonderful as he is. I want him to have the best. Does that extend to Draco too? Ginny asked. What do you mean? Hermione replied and turned to look at her. Well, Ginny began, but was unable to finish, as Ron was suddenly beside them. Did I miss something? Said Ron, skidding up with Benjamin at his heels. Not particularly, Hermione replied smoothly. Did you have fun with your Bela girlfriends? Ron looked miffed. I was just explaining Quidditch. You told them you invented Quidditch, put in Benjamin dolefully. Yes, well, Ron was now red with rather more than cold. I didn't want to say anything before, but what are you two wearing anyway? Ginny glanced down at herself, and Hermione did the same. They were both wearing the winter robes Rowena had created for them. They were made of silky, thin wool, and Ginny was sure that they were enchanted not to be scratchy or prickly, but rather soft and clinging. She loved the deep green color of hers, too. I think they're very pretty, said Hermione, tossing her hair. You look great, said Ron to her, and turned a severe glance at Ginny. Yours are too tight. Couldn't she have given you anything looser? You're just jealous that you didn't get anything to wear, sniffed Ginny. Ron snorted derisively. Like what? Tights? Or whatever they wear here? Benjamin glared at him. Hermione rolled her eyes. That's enough, she announced. Everyone, hold on to me. Now. She pulled Ron and Ginny towards her, linking arms with them, nearly forgetting to say goodbye to Benjamin. It was Ginny who drew him towards her and kissed him on the cheek in thanks. He turned bright pink, and then Hermione touched the lycanthropy at her neck. Mobiliaris, she said, and the world around them spun away into darkness. Draco followed the servant as he led him back to Slytherin, but the room it entered was one Draco had not seen before. It was high-ceilinged, the walls seeming to have been hollowed out of one giant block of stone. There were no windows, but there were shelves holding books and a variety of beautiful magical objects. A miniature painting of a knight on horseback hung above the desk where Slytherin sat, his hands crossed in front of him. The servant went quickly over to Slytherin to lay the square of cloth soaked in Harry's blood on the desk before letting itself silently out. Draco came to stand in front of the desk, his hands in his pockets, feeling extremely tired. Slytherin looked up at him and gave a sly smile.
So you had no issues getting his blood?
It's not exactly difficult to bloodlet a person who is chained to the floor, said Draco, with more than a hint of sarcasm. In answer, Slytherin pushed his chair back from the desk and stood.
Do you ever worry that with such a sharp wit, you will one day cut yourself on its edge?
I have enough to worry about. Being cut up by real sharp edges around here, for example. Slytherin walked to stand by Draco, and he flinched back as the Snake Lord's hand came up and landed on his shoulder. Draco glanced around, desperate to distract himself, and his gaze swept over Slytherin's desk. There were heaps of black parchments there, stacks of dark magic books, and next to them, in between one stack of books and another, lay a sword. Long and shimmering, it was the color of moonlight on water, and as long as the blade of Draco's sword, with the same groove running down the middle. Only this sword didn't end in a hilt. It ended in a lump of bloody tissue that was only somewhat recognizable as a section of human wrist. A wave of nausea washed over him, and without being able to help it, a gagging sound escaped from his throat. Slytherin turned and looked over his shoulder. His eyes lit upon the table, and he smiled.
You recognize that?
He said. Draco nodded reluctantly. Last time I saw it, it was part of Wormtail.
The living blade turned out to be more useful than the servant it was attached to,
said Slytherin, reaching out to run a hand along the blade. He lifted it briefly, watching the light run down its surface like water, then put it down.
It is just as well, as he has served his purpose.
Draco shook his head. And will there be a time when I have only served my purpose? For a moment, Slytherin just looked at him, steadily.
That depends on you. You know, when I was your age, I was eager to experience battle. I assumed you would also want to see how a war is fought.
The world isn't like it was when you were first alive. There are different laws. Even magic has evolved, changed.
I counted upon that,
said Slytherin, nodding.
They have forgotten me. I am a legend now, not real, not a threat. When I fall upon them with my army, they will have no means with which to resist me. It will make my earlier accomplishments pale by comparison. Muggles, mudbloods, those who resist, they will die.
What do you need me for, then? Draco demanded, raising his chin.
You already know the words of the prophecy,
said Slytherin.
However, such prophecies are not immutable. I know this. But when I built the line that resulted in your birth, I created something unique. I had always intended this moment. When I open the orb, the bargain will be fulfilled, and I will make you my source. And when that happens, I will command such powers that I will be the terror of the earth.
Slytherin's eyes were glowing with a weird black light. Draco almost couldn't bear to look at him. Aren't you afraid? He asked, his voice unsteady.
Afraid of what?
I don't know. Draco looked down at his shoes. Retribution.
No,
Slytherin said.
I am afraid of nothing. Fear is born from caring. I care for nothing.
What about Rowena? Draco said. For a moment, Slytherin looked startled, but he recovered quickly.
Love is a sickness.
Draco looked down at the floor, a finger of cold sliding up his spine. Love is a sickness. He had thought that himself, lying awake at night in the Slytherin dorm room those last weeks of school, a year ago, staring up at the ceiling, feeling as if a heavy weight were pressing against his chest, wondering if it was possible to fear so terrible and continue living. Guilty that thoughts of losing Hermione actually drowned out the thoughts of his father behind bars, knowing that he, of all people, might have finally encountered something that he could not buy, or ignore, or ridicule away, that something had happened to him from which he would never recover. He swallowed hard and glanced up, and saw that the door to the room was open, and a servant was standing there, speaking with Slytherin.
Finish the potions with which to test the blood, Master,
the creature was saying.
Would you like to come and see?
Slytherin nodded.
Yes, I would.
He walked back to the desk and picked up the bloody cloth before turning to Draco.
Wait here for me.
Once he was gone, Draco was able to relax, and he began examining the books on the shelves. At random, Draco picked up a book entitled The Dragon Glass, which fell open to an illustration of red dragons in flight. He had just begun to skim it when the door behind him opened with a soft click, and someone poked their head into the room. Draco turned and blinked. A woman was standing in the doorway. one he recognized from his tour of the armies earlier that day. "Raven," he said slowly, plucking her name from some recess of memory. "What is it?" She straightened up and walked into the room, trailed by a tall man in a black traveling cloak, and Draco went rigid. He barely heard Raven speaking as she prattled on about two of the called having arrived suddenly, one of whom, a werewolf, had been sorted in with the other lycanthropes, but that this one was a vampire and there was no place for him. "We just don't have any other vampires," she sighed, looking exasperated. "Alphabetically, I could put him with the Velas, but I don't think that's such a good idea, do you?" Draco tried to find his voice, which had temporarily deserted him. "Leave him here with me," he said finally, his voice coming out slightly shrill. Raven blinked. "What?" "I said leave him here. I want to ask him something." "But I said leave!" She jumped in surprise, then nodded before leaving, quietly shutting the door behind her. Heart pounding like a jackhammer against his ribs, Draco turned to face Sirius. For a moment, the older man just goggled. Then he took a few steps forward across the room, grabbed Draco, and hugged him hard. "We thought you might be dead," he said, knowing he sounded a bit like someone's mother. You could feel how thin the boy had gotten, the bones of his shoulders poking through the thick material of his black cloak. And for just a moment, Draco returned to the embrace, his hands gripping Sirius's back as tightly and awkwardly as if no one had ever hugged him before. Then he pushed him away and took a step back, shaking his head. "Don't do that." "Draco." Sirius took a step forward, but Draco cut him off. "Don't come any closer," he said. Sirius just stared at him, then relented. "Raven said I should wait here to meet with Slytherin's general." "You're looking at him," said Draco, with a sort of desperate amusement. "Like the uniform?" "Not really," said Sirius, taking in Draco's ornamented attire of green and black. "But at the moment I like your attitude even less. What happened to you?" "I think in light of your situation, I should be the one asking the questions," Draco shot back, although his eyes betrayed his fear. "What are you doing here? And why the hell haven't you rescued Harry and left? Everything is about to come crashing down around here." "Remus thought that he's here too?" Draco practically shouted, as the information about a werewolf also arriving clicked into place. "Hurrah for the big reunion! Did we leave anyone at home, or did everyone come to the let's get killed party?" "Draco, how did you get into the castle?" he demanded. Sirius explained, as briefly as possible, and Draco's eyes crinkled in confusion. "But then why," he intoned. "Raven wanted me to meet with you first," said Sirius. "To be honest, I think she's a little suspicious of me." Draco swore at length. Sirius was impressed. He had quite a range of fluency for someone his age, not to mention a deft hand with imagery. "That sounds like it would really hurt," he said gently, when Draco was done, "assuming you could even get it to stretch that far." "Shut up, Sirius, let me think." "I pretty much have to do whatever you want, don't I? Considering you're a general and all." Draco glared at him. "Did you just say you had Harry's key?" "I did." Draco held out his hand. "Give it to me, quickly." "Maybe you might want to tell me what you want with the key first." Draco opened his mouth to reply and stopped. Sirius heard the click as the door behind him began to open, and Draco swung around, so quickly that Sirius's eyes barely followed his movement, and grabbed him by the arm and shoved him hard to the ground. Sirius was so astonished that he actually stumbled and fell. Draco put a hand to his cheek and whispered something Sirius couldn't hear. But when he pulled his hand away, a decent-sized cut in his cheek appeared, seeping blood. Sirius opened his mouth to ask what the hell he was doing, when Raven came into the room again. The Banshee inhaled a shocked breath at the sight of Draco's face. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Draco clapped a hand over his bleeding cheek and assumed a furious and injured look. Raven, this vampire just tried to attack me, he said, pointing at Sirius. Attack you? Intoned Raven and Sirius in unison. Yes. Draco took on the look of poisoned haughtiness. It is against the law to lay hands upon Slytherin, or by extension his heir. Such an act is punishable by death, of course. He raised his chin, the light from the torches turning his hair to a rather ironic silvery halo. Sirius just stared at him. It must be blood sickness, Raven interrupted, looking concerned. Vampires do get that sometimes. Makes them behave quite oddly. That's what I was thinking, Draco agreed smoothly. Since there are no other vampires here that we could consult, I suggest you take him down to the dungeons and keep him contained until the sickness passes. Only, don't harm him. Of course not, said Raven. I would leave that to you, Master. Thank you, said Draco, and there was a sort of desperate hysteria in his voice, although none at all in his eyes as they met Sirius's across the room. He turned his back then, and Sirius couldn't see his face as he said, You'd better take him now, Raven. I have work to attend to. Of course, said the Banshee smoothly, and laid her hand on Sirius's arm. He followed her without protest. Fleur glanced up as the door to the bedroom slammed open and Draco came in. He looked very strange, not in any physical way, but there was a wildness in his eyes and a deathly pallor to his skin. He looked like someone who had had several terrible nightmares in quick succession, and who still was not sure they had entirely woken up. That creature finally brought you your drinks, she said in a small voice, gesturing with her chin towards the low table by the fire, on which sat a row of tall glasses filled with alcohol and topped with little green umbrellas. Well, I'll be damned, said Draco, staring. Then he laughed. Literally, too, he added, strode over to the fire, seized a glass, tossed the umbrella aside, and drained it. Fleur sat up, staring at him. Draco, what are you doing? Getting drunk, he said, and slammed the glass back down on the table. What does it look like? Is that a good idea? Is that a good idea? He echoed, narrowing his eyes at her. What, you don't think I deserve a couple moments of fun? It would so nicely break up the moments of death and mayhem. Why don't you join me? We can hang out, tell jokes, wait for the apocalypse. He showed you the mirror, didn't he? Asked Fleur, looking at him hard. Draco laughed. It had a brittle, explosive sound. What mirror? I don't know what you're talking about. He dragged me off to show me the army I'll be commanding. Dementors, werewolves, icky things with horns sticking out of their ears. It's like a dating club for archfiends, where the lonely and slimy connect. And if that wasn't bad enough, I had to collect blood from Potter for Slytherin's little ritual. And he might have gone on, but Fleur, feeling suddenly alarmed, held out her hand to him. Draco, please, come, sit down. He downed another Mai Tai and glared at her. Next to you? I don't think so. I'd rather kiss a Dementor. And the way things are going, it looks like I might have to, because that's who we'll be hanging around with for the next millennium. And he threw the now empty glass at the fireplace, where it shattered, and the fire hissed as the dregs of alcohol splashed the burning logs. Fleur looked at him anxiously. Millennium? She repeated. Yeah, I'm going to live forever. Didn't you hear? I guess he thinks that's some kind of big prize. But since I've only known him a few days and I already can't stand him, I'm less than excited. I don't exactly want eternity with the guy, but hey, it is what it is. But if you're wondering if you get to live forever, he said with quiet benevolence, you don't. She felt tears stinging the back of her eyes.
I know that.
Good. I'd hate for you to get a nasty surprise.
You're deliberately trying to hurt me.
Yes, I am, he said, and behold my success. She glared at him and felt 2 tears scald their way down her cheeks. Normally, she would have been ashamed to cry in front of someone else, but she was too tired to care.
You enjoy hurting people when you're scared,
she said after a moment.
like pulling the wings off of flies. It's petty and pathetic.
For a moment he was silent. Then suddenly he stalked across the room and closed his hands about her upper arms and pulled her to her feet. She felt the muscles of his hands contract around her, and blades ran through her nerves where he touched her.
Let me tell you something, he breathed. You don't know me. You think you do, but you don't. You don't understand what I really am.
Fleur could feel her heart pounding in her throat, but she would not give in to his taunting.
And you do? Damn right I do. I told you before, she replied quietly, there is no such thing as good and evil. Even if you are the heir of Slytherin, that doesn't make you evil.
It does in my eyes, said Draco, his voice very bitter. Hell, it does in the eyes of everyone with eyes.
Stop,
Fleur interjected, and somehow she found the strength to step back from him, and he actually goggled at her in astonishment.
You are just a person, Draco Malfoy. Just a person like anyone else. Your problem is that you're always running away.
She raised her face slowly and saw him looking at her with the oddest sort of expression in his eyes.
You think you are the only one who has darkness and secrets?
She continued, deciding that the time to explain had finally come.
I know you don't want to hear my reasons for joining the Snake Lord, but since we are here, you might as well know. My sister, Gabrielle, she was born without any magic.
Draco opened his mouth as if to protest, then shut it again.
A squib?
He inquired, his tone cold but curious.
Oui, said Fleur. In my family, if a child does not display some evidence of magical ability before the age of 14, they will be disowned from the family and sent to live in a Muggle orphanage. The child cannot inherit, and no one in the family can have any contact with them anymore. You, of all people, should know that in our families, squibs do not exist, and if they do happen, they are made to not exist anymore. Gabrielle is very fragile. She suffers from many ailments that only magic can help. It is my belief that if she were abandoned to live among Muggles, she would soon die. I wanted to get the source of power, she went on bitterly. I thought if I could do that, I could channel some of it towards Gabrielle. Help her. I tried to get Professor Lupin to talk to me about it at school. He told me there are ways to transfer magic from very powerful objects to people. I tried to use that jewel from your sword, but having it even for a short time called the Snake Lord's attention to me. He promised to help Gabrielle if I would agree to be his source.
He lied then, said Draco, in a much softer tone than before.
No, he did not lie.
Her eyes went to Draco's, and there was a pause before he said, Look. But at that moment, Fleur's body went limp like a rag doll, and, for the second time that day, she fell to the floor in a dead faint. Draco darted forward, just in time to keep her head from hitting the stone floor. He caught her up in his arms, deposited her on the mattress, and bent over her, his heart hammering unpleasantly.
Fleur?
Her head rolled back on his arm, her eyes still closed, their lids bluish. He touched the back of his hand to her forehead and found it cold and clammy.
Fleur!
When she did not respond, he laid a hand over her eyes and concentrated. There was a bright flash of light, and Fleur jumped, her eyes flying open.
What happened?
she asked, struggling to sit up. Draco leaned forward to help her into a sitting position. You fainted again, he said. Fleur reached out and clutched it in. It's happening faster than I would have thought. Draco pulled away from her. He was still wary, she could tell, but some of the hostility had drained away from him. I have to go, he said abruptly. Go? She repeated. Where are you going? She was astonished at the desperation in her own voice. As icy as Draco had been, she did not want to be alone. Fleur sat up straighter, her shoulders set, and the sleeve of her nightgown rucked up just enough that Draco could see the disfiguring scar of the dark mark burned into her creamy skin before she pulled the sleeve back down. I'm paying a little visit to Potter, was all he would say. Don't go, she whispered, without really knowing what she was saying. Exhaustion made it difficult to focus her eyes properly. The Snake Lord, I just sent Harry's godfather down to the dungeons, possibly to die, he said in a whisper. Lupin, I've been told, has shacked up with the werewolves. If either of them die horrible deaths, their blood will be on both our hands. But what happens if... No, he said sharply, and saw her flinch. When he began again, it was much softer. You'll forgive me if I don't tell you all my plans in detail quite yet. You're still not exactly back on my good side. Then he rose and crossed to the door. When Fleur spoke again, Be safe, she said. He looked back at her, nodded, and went out. Draco stood outside the door to the bedroom, imagining Fleur inside, sitting on the bed, waiting for him to return from his quest to see Harry. Through the silence, he heard Slytherin's voice in his head again, telling him about the covenant that held the world together, the necessity of opposites, the dark and the light, day and night, good and evil. He saw Harry's face, too, and the expression on it when he had looked at him in the cell. Not quite rage, not quite disgust, not quite disappointment, but a far worse combination of all three. He sighed and rested the back of his head for a moment on the cool wood of the door and closed his eyes. I put my father behind bars. Maybe not directly, but I let it happen. Now I've put my stepfather in prison again, and I did it with my own hand. The mirror of judgment with its silvery surface rose up in his mind, reflecting back to him his own pale, frightened face. Then, other things. He saw his father staring out at him, his hands covered in blood, and standing behind him the generations of Malfoys, stretching back to Slytherin, who made him what he was. Their faces were like the faces of devils, and Draco had known in that moment that all those generations of wrongdoing had left their stain on him. Even if they weren't his actions, it was his blood. Dark wizardry, murder, necromancy. The blood of innocent people was on his hands. Everything good that he had ever done had been a lie. No, said a sudden sharp voice in his head, one he recognized as belonging to Harry, or at least the part of Harry that he still carried with him. Haven't you done enough? Haven't you proved that you aren't like your father? Didn't you stand up to him? Didn't you save Hermione's life, just like Harry would have? I'm not Harry, he mentally shouted back. I will never be Harry. If I ever acted like him, it was only because of a spell. No, said the voice again. Every bit of goodness in you does not come from Harry. But Fleur is right, you know. You ran away from the manor when you thought Harry and the rest of them didn't trust you anymore. And you ran away from Ginny when she told you to go home. You even ran away from Snape. All you've done is run away from yourself, and you're falling further and further away from anyone who could help you. Who says you have to sit here while these huge events blow up around you?
Why don't you fight? Because wouldn't it be better to make a mistake and do something than be frightened and do nothing? The last thought assailed him like he had been struck with a blasting hex, and Draco's eyes flew open, and he leapt away from the door and began jogging down the hallway as quickly and silently as he could. His mind was working so fast he could hardly keep up with it, but he knew that he had to find something sharp, something that would give him the ability to free Harry from his shackles. Slytherin had taken the sword back, so that option was out. He rounded a bend, and on the wall in the adjoining corridor, Draco spied a row of swords with a sign underneath it that read, "Extremely ancient blades, as sharp as the day they were crafted. Please do not use to cut magical artifacts. These are heirlooms, you Neanderthal." Draco had a split second to wonder if Slytherin had placed that sign there years ago to keep Godric from using his swords to practice cutting various things, before he said, "Perfect," and grabbed one of the more accessible ones on the bottom row and continued his mission towards Harry's cell. When next Hermione, Ron, and Ginny opened their eyes, they found that the Portkey had deposited them in the forest just outside of Slytherin's castle. The structure rose up before them, dark and silent. There were no signs of life anywhere. Hermione turned and saw Ron and Ginny both looking up at the abandoned structure. All three hesitated for a beat before entering. Once inside, the castle had a still, sleepy sort of feel to it, as if it were trapped outside of time. No breath of wind stirred the tapestries as they hurried along the narrow stone corridors. No sound of birds came through the open windows. There was no need for any wards, and Hermione made a split decision and followed a tugging in her own chest that seemed to pulse one word over and over again. Harry, Harry, Harry. The pull led her to the entrance to the adamantine prison, the door of which was open. As they entered, Hermione almost cried out. The walls were exactly the shade of blue she had seen in her vision of Harry. She barely saw the old wardrobe, the shimmering tapestries. The idea that she might be standing only feet from Harry, although 1,000 years away in time, made her desperate. Ron looked a question at her as she stared about the room, but Ginny thought she understood. There was a presence in this cell. Nothing that could be seen, but a vague sense of someone sitting somewhere near the wall. It was distant, but it was definitely there. The redhead reached out once more and pulled the others to her, then flipped the time turner over, and the room, the tapestries, the glowing walls, vanished into the gray mist. It wasn't so bad this time, cold and airless and intense, but when the world finally righted itself again, they were still on their feet, arms linked. Hermione opened her eyes. The room was the same. Blue walls, the tapestries dulled by age and years, now the same wardrobe, and there, against the far wall, sat Harry. He looked exactly as he had in her vision, arms chained behind him, covered in blood, torn and scratched. But he was alive and stared at them in astonishment. She flew across the room and flung herself at him, throwing her arms around him. She felt the muscles in his back contract in surprise. "Hermione?" he said, his voice cracking with disbelief and astonishment. "Yes, it's me," she said, holding him more tightly. She could see, over his shoulder, the bindings that held him. 2 clear cuffs around his wrist, attached to a thick chain that was bolted to what looked like a large adamantine staple driven into the floor. The sight made her panic. She wanted to free him, but couldn't imagine how it could possibly be done. Trying not to think about it, she drew back and kissed his face fiercely and stroked his hair. "I thought I heard your voice earlier, saying my name," he said,
his voice dry and strained. "I thought I was dying, hearing what I most wanted to hear before I—" "Shh!" She kissed his mouth shut. They sat locked together like that for a long moment, Hermione's arms tight around him. Finally, she let go and sat back. "About time you let the poor guy get some air," said Ron's voice from behind her. Hermione looked up. So did Harry, and a huge smile spread across his face as he saw Ron and Ginny. He looked as if he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I cannot believe you guys are here," he said. "Come on, you knew he'd come after you," said Ron amicably, grinning at Harry. "We're your friends. We wouldn't let anything happen to you. Well," he added, taking in Harry's gory state, "aside from the imprisonment and the horrible injuries, of course." Harry shook his head. "It's not my blood." "Well, I'd hate to see the state of the other guy," said Ron, looking impressed. Then his face changed. It was Malfoy. Harry's smile vanished, as if it had been wiped off his face. "He's probably just in another cell, right?" said Hermione hastily, feeling an uneasy prickling under her ribs. "Right, Harry?" Harry sighed and leaned his head back. Then he launched into the story of what had happened over the past few hours, from waking up in the adamantine cell, the fight with the Manticore, to Fleur's betrayal, at which point he was interrupted by Ron, who made a spluttering sort of noise. Hermione, however, had gone ashen and looked as if she were going to be sick. Ginny said nothing. Once Harry finished, Hermione swallowed hard, twice, before she was able to speak. "So, if the Manticore is dead, that must mean that Slytherin has the orb now." "Never mind that," exclaimed Ron. "What about Fleur? I can't believe she would do that." "Ron," said Hermione peevishly, "what happens to the orb is far more important than Fleur being a conniving tramp, which isn't all that surprising if you really thought about it." Ron looked shocked and opened his mouth to protest when Ginny's voice cut in. "What about Draco?" she asked quietly. "Did Slytherin hurt him?" Harry lowered his gaze. "Not exactly." There was a short silence. "Something's wrong," Hermione thought, as she realized that during his explanation of events, he hadn't once mentioned Draco. She leaned forward and put her hand on Harry's cheek, gently turning his head to face her. "Harry, what is it?" "It's about Malfoy," he said. There was a sound of a heavy door being opened, and Hermione glanced quickly towards the sound and saw a large dark square beginning to appear in the far wall. Harry had gone white. "Oh, hell, someone's coming. You've got to get out of here." "No, we can't leave you, Harry," said Ginny. "The invisibility cloak," said Hermione desperately. "Ron!" But Ron had already taken out the cloak. Hermione leapt to her feet as Ron backed against the wall. She and Ginny huddled close to him, and he swept it around the three of them just as the black opening in the wall opened to its fullest extent, and Draco stepped into the room. He was alone this time, and walking rapidly across the floor towards Harry. In his hand was an unsheathed sword, and his expression was so extraordinarily bleak that it nearly stopped Hermione's heart. Before she could formulate much of a thought, quick as lightning, Ron had slipped out from under the invisibility cloak and put himself between Draco and Harry. Draco nearly stumbled and stopped dead in his tracks, clearly caught off guard at seeing the red-headed boy. "Weasley?" he said, his voice sounding more than a little panicked. "How did you get in here?" Ron crossed his arms over his chest. "Never mind that," he said. "Don't come any closer." Draco's mouth twisted into an impatient leer. "Move out of the way, or I'll slice off your leg and beat you to death with the boot end." "I'd like to see you try," Ron said stubbornly. "Weasley, I haven't got much time. Get out of the way." "Put that sword down first," said Ron, not moving. Ron, it's all right, came a voice next to his elbow, and Draco's eyes widened in horror as even Hermione stepped up next to Ron. For a moment, her gaze caught Draco's and interlocked. She had looked into his eyes so many times and seen his love for her reflected back, only now it was overlaid with something else and somehow changed. It was Harry who spoke next, and for the first time since Draco had come into the room. Let him by. Reluctance tempered by confusion, Ron stepped aside, and Draco moved to stand where he had been seconds before. There was a pause, and Hermione saw the bright gleam of blue light on the blade of the sword as he raised it over his head. Draco brought the sword down, so fast and so hard that it seemed to whistle as it cut the air. It sliced down, striking the coils of adamantine chain binding Harry's hands together and shearing them nearly in half. They fell to the ground, not with the clanging sound of metal, but with a hissing sort of noise, like a snake shedding its skin. Hermione caught her breath and started forward, but a hand gripped her arm, preventing her. She knew without looking that it was Ron, but not why he was holding on to her. Harry got very slowly to his feet, reaching out for the wall to steady himself. Finally, Ron let go of her arm, and Hermione ran forward to Harry and put her arms around him, helping him to stand. She felt him grip her shoulder, as if standing up after being chained for so long hurt him. It probably did. He stood still for a moment, as if gauging the steadiness of his legs. Then he took a quick step forward, grabbed a very surprised Draco by the front of his robes, and shoved him hard against the wall. "Potter," Draco began before Harry could do anything. Hearing the other boy's voice in his head, Harry jumped. "What are you doing, LofI? Don't talk out loud. Not that it probably matters, but I have some things I need to tell you." Harry glared at him. "And why should I trust you after you cut a big hole in my arm?" "It wasn't that big of a hole in your arm," Draco pointed out. "Was that supposed to be an apology? Oh, wait, no, that was just you being obnoxious some more." Draco opened his eyes and looked at Harry tensely. "Did you even bother to look in your pocket after I left?" "No? Why on earth would I want to do that?" "You're terrible when it comes to clues, Potter. Why don't you just humor me and look?" Still glaring daggers at the other boy, Harry let one hand drop from his robes, then reached into his pocket. He lifted out the knife, then paused and looked down. Closed, the dull edge of the blade glimmered a dull silver, and the bone handle was etched with his own initials, HJP. There was a faint smear of blood on the side of the blade, but wound around and around the knife, like a vine wrapping the trunk of a tree, was Draco's epicelical charm. Harry's eyes snapped back up to Draco's, and he was shocked to see the other boy smirking. "Would I have given you the charm, the means to kill me, if I wasn't trustworthy?" Harry felt his head beginning to hurt. "Let me get this straight. You gave me the charm to show I could trust you." "Yes. And how do I know that you aren't telling me this just so Slytherin can hear us? He's a magician too, you know." "I don't think he can hear us. Not in this cell, anyway. But never mind that. There's something you need to know. It's the reason I came here in the first place." "Is this something that's going to really, really upset me?" Draco paused for a moment. "Yes." "Is it absolutely necessary that I know this?" Another pause. "Yes." "Fine. What is it?" "Sirius is here, in the castle," Draco said, making sure to say it so that the others could hear. Harry's heart leapt up and banged painfully against his ribcage, but Ron and Hermione were the first to speak. "What?" said Ron, overlapped by Hermione's frightened, "Where?" "In the dungeon," replied Draco, as he felt the edges of Harry's fingers slip away from his robes. "Slytherin threw him in the dungeon?" said Ron, looking green. "No." Draco tilted up his head and looked Ron directly in the eyes. "I threw him in the dungeon." There was a long moment of silence. "Just never stops with you, does it?" whispered Harry in an icy voice. "Do you want me to hate you?" "I told you because it's the truth, and you should know it," said Draco tonelessly. "Now there's a new attitude coming from you," snarled Harry, who seemed to be recovering from his shock at last. "I thought your idea of the right way to handle these things was to wait until you needed an animating case smashed, and then, hey, out with the truth. Let's see how hacked off Harry can get. Let's throw his godfather in jail for a lark. The man only ever spent 12 years in Azkaban. Did you ever—" "I was trying to save his life!" Draco yelled at the top of his lungs. "He would have died if I hadn't thrown him in there, and so would you bloody have if I hadn't done what I did. Now there's circular logic for you," shouted Harry, his words bouncing off the wall of the cell, mingling with the echo of Draco's voice. "You saved me from Slytherin. Congratulations! Pin a medal on this guy. He's a hero. Slytherin wants you dead," Draco said bluntly. "I stalled him by telling him there was some kind of charm on your life. That's why he wanted your blood. Now that he's examined it, he'll come for you. You have to get out of here before that happens." "Oh, perfect," retorted Harry sarcastically. "So, you came all this way to release my bonds, then turn around to tell me that Sirius is imprisoned here, all while shooing me out the door? And how exactly did you plan to keep Sirius out of danger, should the Snake Lord get his way? What's your brilliant plan for that?" "I've got no bloody plan, all right!" roared Draco, losing his temper completely. "I'm just winging it. And as for Sirius, he came here in disguise, you stupid twonk, as a vampire. But all dark creatures coming into the castle have to be tested, and the test is fatal to humans. So I had to put him where they wouldn't be able to get at him. Not now, anyway. He's safe there, and I'm done explaining myself to you, Potter. I am sick and tired of you not believing me, you whinging, mealy-mouthed, four-eyed bastard." Draco brought himself up short, gasping for breath, as if he had been running. Harry looked at him in surprise. He had never seen Draco so visibly angry before. It was a bit of a shock, and somehow Harry felt his own anger drain out of him, as if someone had pulled the plug on a basin filled with boiling, poisonous water. He raised his head to look Draco squarely in the eye, and opened his mouth to retort when they heard Hermione give a little start of surprise. "Oh my God," she said, and both boys turned to see that she was looking down at the invisibility cloak, her hand on her mouth. It took only a second. Then Ron went very white as he leaned back against the wall, as if his legs had given out. "Ginny," he said edgily. "Where the hell is Ginny?" Ginny's mind had been working like a freight train after Ron had stepped out from under the invisibility cloak to face off against Draco. Mutely, she had listened while the two boys bantered, but it had been Hermione also stepping out from the cloak that had made up her mind. Standing around and bickering was pointless. They needed to do something. Instinctively, she had reached for the time turner, and without really thinking about what she was doing or why, turned it over. She found herself falling through clouds of violet blackness, but in no recognizable direction. It might have been up, down, or sideways through space. Everything had vanished, and all she knew was an endless moment of vertigo. Then the dizzying emptiness vanished in a breath, and she was standing with her feet on solid ground, surrounded by blackness. She strained her eyes to see, her heart pounding. In the darkness of what appeared to be night, she could not see her own hands in front of her face. Scrambling for her wand, she whispered, "Lumos." Light blossomed from the wand's end, lighting her surroundings. She was standing in an adamantine cell, exactly where she had expected to arrive. It looked much the same, although the floor was thickly layered in dust, and the torches were missing from the wall brackets. She hurried out, suddenly desperate to get outside of the castle, which had a grim, deserted sort of feeling. Reaching the end of a corridor, she found a heavy, curving stone staircase and barreled down it as fast as safety permitted. When she reached the foot of the stairs, she found herself in a huge antechamber whose floor was patterned with green and white squares of marble, like a chessboard. She raced across the floor to the huge double doors, yanked them open, and stepped outside. For a moment, she was unable to grasp quite what it was that she was looking at. It was lighter here, but the source was almost blocked entirely by an enormous wall surrounding the castle. Ginny stared in surprise. She had no idea where the wall had come from. Circular and huge, it seemed to stretch in all directions around the castle and up, 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 as far as her eye could see, vanishing into dim nothingness against a smidgen of blue sky the size of a child's marble. As she slowly descended the stairs, she became aware that the wall was not smooth at all, but uneven and irregular, and starred with strange red blossoms. Roses, she thought, almost giggling with the intensity of the nervousness she felt. Driven by an impulse she couldn't quite identify, she reached out and gently touched the time turner to the edge of a leaf. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a loud surge, like the sound of many rushing waters, began to curl the branches away from her, opening a path to let her through. On the other side of the gap, she glimpsed brilliant green grass and white flowers. She stepped through quickly, and the hedge sealed itself up behind her, as if there had never been a hole to begin with. She stood in a clearing, and in the distance, she could see the dark line of trees where the forest began. In front of it stood a number of multicolored tents. She set forth nearly at a run, suddenly filled with a desperation to see people. The castle had been so silent, so eerie. She reached the center of the camp and glanced around. There were tents in many colors, blue, bright green, orange, and to her left a tall scarlet tent, bearing on its closed flap the emblem of a golden lion. Gryffindor. She ran towards it, then paused at the entrance. There was nowhere to knock that she could tell, and gingerly she reached forward and drew back the corner of the tent flap and peered into the darkness inside. Like most wizarding tents, the interior bore no resemblance to the exterior. Inside, the walls were made of dark paneled wood, with a fireplace, a number of small windows without panes, and a large round mahogany table in the center of the room, which was embossed with patterns of stars and moons and gold. Leaning against one table leg, quite casually, was a long silver sword in a scabbard of marred dark silver, engraved all over with brilliant designs of flowers and animals and leaves. The hilt of the sword was set with scarlet stones, which formed the shape of a lion. Ginny sucked in her breath, looking at the hilt. If that's the sword of Gryffindor, then surely... A movement in the corner of the room caught her eye. She turned and saw someone staring back. Sitting in the corner of the tent, on a wooden footstool, was a tall man. He looked as if he were about 20, and was wearing archaic wizarding robes in scarlet, a pair of leather breeches, and seemed to be in the middle of doing up the laces on his boots. He stared at Ginny. Letting his other boot drop to the ground, he stood up and asked in a deep, commanding voice, "What are you doing in my tent?" "What do you mean, where the hell is Ginny?" asked Draco, the urgency in his voice taking on a much sharper tone. "And while we're on the subject, what the hell are any of you doing here? What is this? Some sort of hero's coffee break? Thought you'd come by and say hello. I bet your mum is going to be super excited to learn that you dragged your little sister along for the ride, Weasley." "We didn't exactly have a choice," Ron yelled back. His face was pale with rage and fear, his freckles standing out in splotches.
Do you honestly think that my sister would ever want to be left out of any situation, especially one where you're involved?"
Draco didn't appear to have anything to say to that, so instead said nothing. Harry looked at Hermione, who was looking just as shaken as Draco.
"She's got the time turner," she said softly. "Maybe she used it to get away. Or maybe she went back in time to get help, or—"
"Stop," said Ron suddenly. "Just stop, Hermione. I'm sorry, but I don't want to hear any theories right now. I need to think." "There's a first," said Draco, knowing that he should probably keep silent, but this new addition to their increasing number of problems was beginning to fray his nerves.
"What did you say?"
asked Ron in a soft and dangerous tone.
"You know, I put up with a lot from you, Malfoy, mostly for Harry's sake. But when my sister goes missing, you would think that we would have the sense to keep your smarmy mouth shut before I ruin your face."
"You're right, Weasley," replied Draco just as dangerously. "I'm the one who convinced your sister to risk her life to come to a dangerous castle where, at any moment, she might be killed by Slytherin, just so I can see him reach his kill quota for the day."
"Well, I think you're a selfish prat who doesn't deserve to be loved by people who are obviously better than you," Ron retorted, "but that's my opinion."
Draco looked as if he had reached the end of his endurance.
"Well, how would you like me to put my fist in your opinion?" "Enough!" said Hermione sharply, and both boys turned to stare at her. "You two, either have a proper fight or shut up and get along. Ron, I don't know why Ginny did what she did, but I believe that she will come back. Draco, it's not your fault that Ginny came with us, but what we have to focus on now is getting out of here."
They all stared at her, and both Draco and Ron relented, if somewhat reluctantly. "This is a very bad time to be wandering around the castle," Draco began after a moment's pause. "Events are on the move, and if Ginny is gone, the rest of you need to leave, now." Hermione felt as if her blood had turned to ice water.
"But we came here to rescue both of you."
He shook his head, avoiding her eyes. "The walls are charmed to recognize Harry as a prisoner here. If he leaves, the alarms will go off. He'll be overwhelmed by Dementors within seconds."
"And Harry stays here," said Ron firmly. "I'll go look for Sirius." "I'll come with you," said Hermione quickly.
"Hermione, no," said Harry, even more swiftly. She turned back to him and saw that he had gone quite pale.
"Harry, it might be our only way to find him. We'll take the cloak. It'll be safe. I don't want to go wandering around here any more than Ron does, but it makes sense."
Harry was staring at her intently. "If that's the plan, then I need you to come here for a second, Hermione," he said in a fierce, low tone. "Please." She let him take her hand and draw her across the room, around the side of the wardrobe, where there was a modicum of privacy. Of course, she could still hear Draco's voice, telling Ron to take the cloak, and he'd give him some instructions on how to find his way around the castle.
"Draco Malfoy deigning to help us," Ron replied irritably. "Finally, I could die happy."
"That can be arranged," replied Draco, ice in his tone.
"Listen, Malfoy, you can take your instructions and you can shove them right up your—"
"Hermione, are you listening?" Harry said. She turned and raised her face to his and caught her breath. He was very white as he had been the day when he had stood in front of the mirror of Erised and had told her he loved her. She wondered what terrible thing was weighing on his mind now, or perhaps it was just the danger they were in. She reached out and took his hands. "I don't want you to go," he said, with a sudden and surprising intensity. "I have a bad feeling about this, Hermione. I want you to stay."
"I have to go. Sirius,
I know." He drew her towards him by the wrists. "I know, but there are worse things than just dying," he said. "I couldn't stand it if something happened to you, and I had to wonder if you were somewhere waiting for me." Having no idea what he was talking about, Hermione flung her arms around him and hugged him hard, and he brushed a hesitant hand over her hair. "I've
I've always loved your hair, he said. Oh, surely not, said Hermione before she could help it. Remember how Ron used to say it looked like I had a very angry cat on my head? Harry choked. Yes, he was also 12, Hermione. It was still very rude of him, said Hermione as she reached up and pulled his head down and kissed him soundly. It was a brief kiss, and when she broke it off, Harry led her back to the center of the room, where Draco was leaning against the wall near the cell entrance, all elegant scowling and long legs and arms crossed over his chest. Ron was glaring at Draco from the other side, and Hermione wasted no time grabbing Ron's hand and began dragging him towards the exit. After the dark opening in the wall closed up behind Hermione and Ron, Harry felt a wave of fear wash over him. He turned away, fell back against the wall, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the first thing he saw was Draco, looking back at him, his gray eyes very wide and nearly transparent in the glare of the blue light. He looked extraordinarily uncomfortable, as if he very much wished to be somewhere else, and in fact was imagining that he was somewhere else. He almost didn't seem to see Harry at all. Harry realized that he was still clutching the chain of the epicilical charm in one hand. "Well?" said Draco after an awkward silence. "Well, what, Malfoy? Are you going to wear that charm or not? It's not safe, you know, just holding it like that." Harry was silent, but finally he said, "I don't know. You still don't believe that I joined up with Slytherin in order to save your life, do you?" he asked. Harry expelled a weary-sounding breath. "Yes, I believe you did what you had to do, although I do think you probably got a bigger kick out of it than you're willing to admit." Draco couldn't suppress the grin that spread over his face. "Maybe." Against his better judgment, Harry smiled back. Then he looked down at the epicilical charm in his hand. There was a weight to it in his palm, but it was also surprisingly light for what it was. The essence of a human life made manifest. He unclasped the chain, then paused for a moment before he fastened it around his neck, dropping the charm down into his shirt. "This is a lot of responsibility, Malfoy," he said, staring down at it. The other boy shrugged. "Not for you. It's just what you are." "I'm sorry," said Harry's voice, suddenly clear as daylight inside the other boy's head. Draco's eyes widened. "What for?" "For a lot of things, but mostly because I never told you I was sorry that your father died." Shock moved across Draco's face, followed by suspicion. "I figured that was because you weren't sorry. He wasn't the nicest guy, and he was planning on killing you. You could be forgiven for not feeling I'm the last person to want anyone to lose their parents," Harry replied. For a moment, that statement simply hung there, so heavy that Harry could almost imagine his words painted on the air between them. Draco looked as if he were grasping after words, which Harry wouldn't have previously imagined was possible. Finally, he straightened his shoulders and looked at Harry squarely. "About your parents, Potter. About what I said. Forget it." "Forget it?" Draco looked very briefly blank with shock. Whatever he had been expecting Harry to say, it hadn't been that. But shock soon gave way to unhappiness. "Well, if that's what you really want." He glanced away. Harry watched him and felt, suddenly, contrite. More than contrite, as if he had hurt Ron or Hermione, or someone else close enough to him that their pain had become, in some sense, his responsibility. "Malfoy, I do forgive you," he said, and stretched out a hand. Draco stood there for another long moment, looking at it, his gray eyes unreadable. Suddenly, Harry was reminded of Draco at 11, holding out his hand in the train compartment for Harry to take, and Harry hadn't done it. Now he held out his own hand and waited for Draco to take it, thinking it would be poetic justice if he refused. Finally,
A smile broke out over Draco's face, one of his rare, infrequent smiles.
So, we're all right then?
Yeah, replied Harry.
Yeah, I think so. But please don't do anything like that to me again. Next time I'll take your head off.
Draco reached out and took Harry's hand. The scars on their palms brushed each other, and Harry felt a bolt of cold go through him. Draco's eyes unfocused slightly, almost as if he were looking at something beyond Harry.
So, you trust me? I trust you,
Harry said, then froze.
Look behind you,
he said, his voice sounding almost like an explosion in Draco's brain. Slowly, Draco turned and saw, ranged against the far wall, 6 tall figures in belted robes, their skin scaly, dark gray and patchy in places, their eyes red and whirling, their heads knobbed and lumpy. The tallest of them stood in front, and in its hand it cupped a single flame that flickered with an emerald light. Demons. They stood facing each other across a small round table, Ginny on one side, the strange man who was definitely Benjamin on the other. He was fully dressed now, and still staring at her, as he had been since she had arrived, as if he had seen a ghost.
At first I thought you were Helga,
he began at last, his eyes still wide in his face.
That's all right, she said, a little hesitant. At first I thought you were Harry.
The man raised his eyebrows at her.
Ah, yes, that friend you mentioned last time, he said. What I don't understand, though, is why you're back.
Ginny drew herself up a little taller and looked the other man straight in the eyes.
I came back to ask if I could borrow an army.
Benjamin's eyes grew very wide. Apparently that was not exactly what he had been expecting her to ask when she showed up.
Borrow an army?
He repeated, stunned. Ginny sighed.
Yes, she said firmly, then added, Look, we haven't got the resources to face Slytherin in the future. He's got all the dark creatures on his side. The werewolves, the trolls, and the Dementors. There are just so many of them.
He raised his eyebrows, but before he could ask anything more, the tent flap opened, and a house elf came in with fruit, bread, and cheeses on a tray. Suddenly famished, Ginny eyed the food with ravenous eyes. She looked up at Ben, and he made a motion that she was welcome to share whatever he had. Grateful, she tore into the food, and when she looked up again, he was still gazing at her, a faint line of worry between his eyebrows.
I knew that you were in the midst of facing Slytherin the last time you were here, but that doesn't explain your sudden appearance and needing an army, he said. I mean, yes, this is clearly a war encampment, so forming one would be quite easy. But what good would it do you? We're here, in our time. I thought I could bring them through, said Ginny, fixing her eyes on Ben. This key of Helga's, this time turner, is very powerful. If I could borrow your army, I'm pretty sure I could bring them all through to my own time. I can't explain how I know that, but I can do it.
But Ben was shaking his head, and Ginny saw, with a sinking feeling, that he looked not intrigued by her suggestion, but appalled. It's not a good idea, Ginny. When she was alive, Helga used to talk about time paradoxes. What you are talking about, that's just the sort of thing you'd be creating. The result might be an alternate future, one where you or your friends were never born at all. I'm so sorry, Ginny, he said. I can't help you. The dungeon was a dungeon that bore a startling resemblance to other dungeons Sirius had been in. Thick stone walls which dripped with unpleasant moisture, grey cell bars that were wound around with magical wards, and the smell of moss, old sweat, and fear. The silence seemed to stretch on and on. Dungeons were all the same. At least he had his clothes back. Before Raven had assigned him this cell, she had insisted on a strip search. Sirius hadn't wanted to, and had privately thought that she had done it because she seemed to find him attractive. But pissing off a banshee seemed like a bad idea, so he had agreed to the search. Luckily, she had allowed him to keep all the possessions he had stored inside his pockets, save for his wand. He wondered how long it would be possible to survive on every flavor beans. To distract himself, Sirius reached into his pockets and began to spread their contents on the ground in front of him. Idly, he picked up one of the letters from his old girlfriends and flipped it open randomly.
Darling Sirius, I'm sitting here in History of Magic, thinking about whether I should catch up on that sleep I missed last night while we were watching the stars. Anyway, is it just me, or is Professor Ben's getting kind of dusty?
Sirius grinned and shoved the letter back into his pocket. There were the other letters, addressed to James in Lily's delicate handwriting, the sight of which made his throat close up and his chest tighten. James Potter, 30 Galloping Drive, Godric's Hollow, Wales. The sight of the address written there in Lily's hand brought up the memory of the house and its blasted ruins, the feeling of grit under his hands as he crawled over broken wood and stone, tasting bitter copper in his mouth where he had bitten his lip. He had known right away that James was dead, could see him where he had fallen, on his back, one hand flung out and clutching the wand that, in the end, had been no use to him. His glasses had fallen off, and Sirius wanted to find them and give them back because, of course, James couldn't see properly without his glasses. He never could. There in the broken house, choking on poisonous dust, Sirius had put his face down on James's shoulder and cried, a sound too awful and profound to produce any tears. He whispered under his breath, asking James to come back, to please come back. But the dead are selfish and reluctant travelers. They do not come back, no matter how much they are needed, no matter how greatly they are missed, no matter if their loss can be survived by those who are left behind. He tightened his fist on the parchment, crumpling it in his hand.
We go this way,
Hermione was saying as she steered Ron out of the stairwell and down a corridor. He didn't protest as he followed her, but she could feel the tension in Ron's shoulder where it pressed into hers under the cloak. The hallway ended in a staircase, whose steps were so worn that many of them seemed almost no more than irregularities in the stone. Hermione wondered whose feet had originally worn them down as she and Ron began to descend. A clear memory formed in her head of racing down these steps before, hand in hand with someone else. Someone not Ron. Someone with silver hair. As the vision became clearer, she stopped and put out a hand to steady herself. She heard Ron's voice in her ear. Hermione, what's wrong?
Nothing. I'm fine.
But she wasn't. They turned a corridor and found themselves in a broad, semicircular hallway whose walls were bare, save for the innumerable doors. Hermione knew, as if by memory, that once they had been hung with tapestries depicting a unicorn hunt, and the ceiling had been enameled with stars. There had been couches along the walls, long couches covered in pillows of scarlet and emerald and blue, and she remembered having lain down on those couches, and not alone either. Hermione felt herself turn scarlet and was very glad that she was invisible. She looked down, realized she was clutching the lycanthie, and released it quickly. The memory pressing in on her faded slightly, but she was sure that she was still bright red, though. How did one do that on a couch without falling off? Hermione, it was Ron, speaking into her ear again. Do you hear that? She raised her head, a little dizzy. What? Listen, someone's crying. Hermione swiveled her head, listening, and heard it. The faint sound of sobbing coming from behind one of the closed doors.
That doesn't sound like Sirius,
she said positively, but Ron had already grabbed her hand and was dragging her towards the door. She felt him glance around, then push it open, and they went through. The room they entered was bare, the ceiling very low. It was also very dark. But then, as they stared, they saw a patch of greater darkness and a huddled shape like a puddle of shadow in one corner, from which the crying sound originated. As they drew uncertainly towards the shape, it resolved itself into a short, round, and plump man, whose balding head glimmered in the faint light, and whose sniveling cries were very, very familiar. "Wormtail," hissed Ron in astonishment. Wormtail's body jerked to attention with a rattling sound, and Hermione saw that there was a cuff around his leg, chaining him to the wall. "Who's there?" he barked shrilly. Hermione caught at Ron's arm, but it was too late. He had stepped out from under the invisibility cloak and was standing with his wand pointed at the man, his blue eyes blazing with rage. "You murderer," he hissed. "What are you doing here?" squeaked Wormtail, thrashing about in his chains as if he could get farther away from Ron somehow. His eyes were huge and fearful. Hermione pulled the cloak off herself and rushed over to Ron, catching his arm. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to kill him," said Ron. "Somebody ought to have a long time ago." "Ron, you don't know how to do the killing curse." "I can try it till I get it right," he said, his wand still aimed at Wormtail's heart. "Ron, don't!" Hermione lunged at him and wrestled his wand out of his hand. Ron looked at her mutinously, and for a moment she thought he might try to get his wand back from her, but instead he glared at Wormtail and said quietly, "Fine. If I'm not allowed to kill him, then at least I should be allowed to question him. I want to know what he knows." "Do I look like I know anything?" spat Wormtail. "Do I look like I'm still my master's most trusted confidant? He said I betrayed him by letting his heir nearly die. He kept me alive, but he took." He made a sniveling gasp as he yanked back his right sleeve and held out his arm. His hand was gone. His pale, pudgy arm ended in a blackened stump of scar tissue. Hermione swallowed her nausea. She had no sympathy for him. If there was any one person in the world she hated without reservation, it was Wormtail, but still the sight was sickening. "Do you know what his plans are?" Ron demanded, his eyes fastened on Wormtail's pudgy, fearful face. "What he wants with Harry?" Wormtail's eyes widened, sweating more profusely, as he usually did when he was afraid. "He's got Harry?" Ron almost seemed to be vibrating with rage. "Don't pretend like you don't know," he snarled. "It's your fault. All of this is your fault." In response, Wormtail licked his lips, then said in a voice so hushed Hermione had to strain to hear, "It's the orb you want." Hermione felt her eyes go wide. "What?" "The orb," Wormtail repeated, his eyes glittering with what could have been madness or fear. "If you can get to that before he manages to fulfill his bargain with the demons, you might have a chance." Hermione reached out and clutched at Ron's wrist. She remembered Draco telling her about the orb after he had recovered from nearly dying. "Where is the orb?" she said, her voice unsteady. "Where is he keeping it?" "When you were first here, you remember that he took you to a room with a tapestry of the founders in it. It's in there." Ron made an impatient sort of noise. "Like we would believe anything you say. Let's go, Hermione." "Wait," said Wormtail, his tone desperate, pleading even. "In my pocket, there is something vitally important." "What?" said Hermione, curious despite herself. Wormtail struggled for a moment in his pocket, a movement that looked like it pained him. After a few seconds of fumbling, he drew out something that looked like a small glass marble.
"This is for you,"
said Wormtail, and offered it to Hermione. She stared at the object in Wormtail's proffered hand, and, before Ron could stop her, she had darted forward and plucked the thing neatly from between his sweaty fingers. "What is this?" she asked as she took it.
"Not exactly sure,"
said Wormtail in a hushed whisper. Ron snorted with derision. "I'll bet it's some kind of tracking device to call Slytherin to us. Give it back to him and come away, Hermione." But Hermione wasn't listening. She was looking at the glass marble with great interest, her senses prickling all over with the feeling that it held something important inside. From the outside, she could see how dark the marble was, but a little animated flame that seemed to be dancing inside it. Actually, when she looked closely, she could see that there were actually 3 small, separate flames, flickering apart and then together. A silver band ran around the middle of the marble, chased with a barely legible inscription in Latin. Hermione could make out only one word: Abdunatio. It was a word that could have meant unity or joining. Hermione looked back up at Wormtail and saw that his eyes were shining with more than just tears. "What does this do?" she demanded. Again, Wormtail licked his lips.
"I don't know, but I believe it's some sort of key. Something that will bring the Snake Lord to his knees. Something that will cause the end of all this."
"And how do we know you're not lying, and that thing isn't some sort of weapon that will cause the whole castle to come crashing down around our ears?" Ron questioned from behind her. Wormtail's eyes flicked briefly to the red-haired boy.
"You don't."
"Bastard," Ron hissed under his breath, and he grabbed Hermione's arm and began to lead her towards the door again. When they were back in the hall, Hermione unfurled the cloak and threw it to Ron. Then she reached around her throat, took off the lycanthie, and placed it in the palm of her hand. "Ultima Thule," she said, and the lycanthie swung around and pointed north. "What are you doing?" Ron demanded. "The room he was talking about was in the west part of the castle. I remember seeing the sunset out the window while I was looking at the tapestry." "Hermione, you don't believe him, do you?" protested Ron, shaking his head so that his red hair fell into his eyes. "He's probably leading us into a trap. West might hold some room full of guards or something. And what about Sirius?" "We've got the cloak," said Hermione a little weakly. "It wouldn't hurt to check." Ron gave her a steady, searching look. Finally, he nodded reluctantly, and Hermione wrapped the cloak around them and headed towards the easternmost corridor. It twisted sharply to the right, then to the left, then to the right again. And just as they turned the last blind corner, they ran directly into the arms of a large group of grey-robed guards. "I'm sorry," Ben said again, his voice tinged with pity and anxiety. Ginny barely heard him. She had her hands over her face and was staring at the darkness behind her lids, at nothingness. "Never mind," she said, and took her hands away. Taking a deep breath, she turned as if to leave, feeling suddenly miserable and desperate to get away. "It's not your fault, and if there's nothing you can do, I should go back." "Wait," said Ben, and caught at her arm before she could walk out. "Don't tell me there's nothing I can do. It sounds like you're fighting a losing battle, and it's not your battle. It is, though. Slytherin killed my father." Ginny glanced up at him. He had a bit of the expression that Harry got when he was talking about his parents. Closed off. "I'm sorry," she began haltingly. "What about your mother?" "I was so young when she died. I only know what people told me," said Ben.
It was right around the beginning of the war. The Snake Lord had just come to power and was wreaking havoc on the wizarding world, recruiting giants and dragons to serve him, destroying whole armies, making them vanish. Ginny suddenly sat down so quickly that he started. "Ben," she said hoarsely, and gripped the edge of the table so hard it hurt her hands. "When we were here before, Rowena mentioned an army that Slytherin made vanish into thin air, but she didn't exactly have time to elaborate. Is it true? Was it more than once?" "It was just once," he replied slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was when I was 10 years old. An army was sent out from Ravenclaw, a company of about 250 men and warriors and beasts. They never arrived at their destination." "Ben," said Ginny again, "what if the reason they never arrived wasn't because Slytherin made them vanish? What if it was because we brought them forward into the future?" Ben goggled at her, really goggled. His eyes widened and his mouth fell open, and she realized that she had truly astonished him. Amid the whirling chaos of her thoughts, she felt somewhat proud about that. "But," he began, still staring, "can't go. I mean, it would change history." "No, it wouldn't," said Ginny staunchly. "It's already happened." "Confident, aren't you?" said Ben, but he was beginning to smile now. "I have to be," said Ginny. "This is my only hope, and I need to be accurate with the time turner, or this will never work." "Magnifying a time turner's accuracy isn't so difficult if you have the right tools. All you have to do is accentuate the metamorphosis of the synchronicity between the temporal infrastructures." Now it was Ginny's turn to goggle. "How do you know so much about time travel?" she asked. "From Helga," he said. "She and Rowena helped raise me. Helga never had any sons, only daughters, so I think she felt a bit as if I were hers. In fact, I should show you something." Ginny looked after him as he went into another room in the tent. When he returned, he was carrying a stack of books. She watched curiously as he sat down and opened the topmost one. The cover was dark leather, stamped with gold along the spine, and much larger than any book Ginny had seen before, except for a few that were kept in the antiquities section of the library, and which students were prevented from touching with powerful security charms. "You do know about the prophecies, don't you?" he asked. "I know there's a prophecy that the heir of Slytherin will rise up and wreak havoc on the wizarding world," she said reluctantly. "So there is," said Ben. "There's also a prophecy that the heir of Gryffindor will bring him to destruction, and that the heir of Slytherin will help. Don't those conflict each other?" Ben nodded. "That usually means that there's some event, some kind of turning point, that could go either way. The outcome of that moment determines which prophecy is correct for your reality. It might have already happened, and it might not have. You wouldn't know." "Then maybe the heir of Gryffindor that brings him to destruction isn't Harry," said Ginny. "Maybe it's you." Ben blinked, as if this had not occurred to him. "When my father died," he said slowly, "he cursed his murderer. The death curse of a wizard is a powerful thing, and they often come to pass." "What was the curse?" Ben shook his head, his face taking on that closed look again. "I don't know. I don't think anybody is sure what his words were." Ginny thought it best to change the subject. "So, you can show me how to modify the time turner, or whatever it was you said before?" "That," he said, looking at the table, "is probably not the best approach." Ginny's heart sank again. The plan she'd been forming in her head since what needed to be done to the time turner crumbled to the ground as she watched him. Then he lifted his hand and snapped his fingers, once. There was a rustle of wings, and a small apricot-colored horned owl lifted off its perch near the door with a soft "Ooh!" and came to rest on his arm. Ben took a roll of parchment from the owl's leg, smoothed it out, picked a quill up off the table, and wrote several short lines.
When he finished, he rolled his letter back up, tied it to the owl's leg, and sent the bird off with another snap of his fingers. He watched it go, seeming lost in thought. After a moment, Ginny cleared her throat. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Well," said Ben, "you can't expect me to just go dozens of years into the past without leaving anyone a note saying where I'm going, can you?" Ginny blinked, then felt a huge smile begin to spread across her face. "Do you think we're going to die?" said Ron, sounding curious. Hermione lifted her face out of her hands and looked at him dully. The cell they were in was a windowless stone room without straw on the floor or a bench to sit on. The walls were dank and freezing to the touch. She tugged at the bottom of her dress idly, trying to get her ankles warm. "I don't know," she said softly, and glanced down. "I'd imagine those guards are going to report finding us to Slytherin, and he'll probably come for us." Ron was looking away now, and she could see the bruise on one cheek where one of the guards had struck him when he resisted having the invisibility cloak taken away. "I can't believe I lost it," he said after a moment, and Hermione didn't have to ask what he meant. "I know. It belonged to his father. I know. Don't dwell, Ron. He's going to be panicking over where we are, not worrying about his stupid cloak," said Hermione with a sort of despair. She couldn't bear thinking about how worried Harry would be. She turned away from Ron and miserably began poking at a loose brick in the wall. Ron was silent for a moment, and she felt rather than heard him get to his feet and come to sit beside her. "Hermione?" "Yeah?" "If we're going to die anyway, don't be defeatist," she admonished, still poking at the wall. "Well, you admit it looks bad for us." "I don't admit anything." "Yeah, you never do." "I'm not going to squabble with you right now." "Look, I'm just saying, I always thought I'd have sex before I died," he muttered thoughtfully. Hermione stopped poking the wall. "Ron, honestly!" Ron ignored this. "Be that as it may, as we are, obviously, going to die, then there's something I think I should tell you." She looked at his suddenly serious expression in surprised bewilderment. "What are you going on about?" He reached out then and took hold of her hands, closing his fingers a little awkwardly around them. She looked at him in utter bewilderment, shocked by the clouded, troubled look in his blue eyes. "I hope this doesn't make you hate me," he began, his voice very low and urgent, "because I don't know what I'd do if you hated me, but I have to tell you that—" "Psst!" Hermione's head whipped around. "Did you hear that?" Ron looked mutinous. "I didn't hear anything." The noise came again. "Psst! Hermione, Ron!" Hermione yanked her hand out of Ron's and spun around, listening for the source of the noise. "Who's there?" she whispered, her eyes huge. Ron was goggling as well now. "That sounded like Sirius," he whispered. "It is me," came the voice again, and this time Hermione was able to gauge the location the voice was emanating from. "The wall. I think you managed to loosen one of the bricks by scraping at it, so I pulled it. Can you see me?" Ron at her side, Hermione stared at the wall until she found the dark opening Sirius had made. Then she scrambled towards it, bending down to stare, and found Sirius's bright dark eyes looking back from the other side. "Sirius!" she gasped, both wildly relieved and horrified to see him at the same time. "Are you all right?" he said, and there was a note of panic in his voice. "Are you hurt at all?" "I'm fine," she said, a huge lump forming in her throat. "Not hurt at all." "And Ron?" Hermione leaned back as Ron took her place at the wall. He looked just as relieved and shocked as she felt. "I'm a little bruised, but okay," he exclaimed. "But what about you? How long have you been down here?" "A few hours," said Sirius briefly, and there was a hint of "I don't want to talk about it" note in his voice. "I was listening to you talk for a while before I realized who you were, and none of us are going to die, all right?" "All right," said Ron, managing half a grin. "Oh, and Ron? Yeah? Don't worry about the not having sex. Don't worry about the not having had sex business," said Sirius magnanimously. "You're only 16. Good things come to those who wait." "What are you lot doing here?" asked Draco resignedly, as he stared at the demons.
"We were invited,"
said the head demon speculatively, as he sidled closer to the two boys. "I didn't invite you," said Draco positively. He turned to Harry, who by now had dropped his hand and was looking stunned. "Did you invite them?" Harry shook his head. Draco turned back to the demons. "I don't suppose," he began casually, "it would make any difference if I told you the toga party was down the hall."
"Funny little mortal boy,"
said the head demon, and Draco decided that he really didn't like the emphasis that was put on the word mortal.
"You did not summon us or demand our presence. It was a change in the prophecy that did it."
Draco looked at Harry, then back at the cluster of demons. "What prophecy?" he said. "You mean the one where I'm supposed to help Slytherin wreak havoc on the wizarding world? Because if you do, I don't think it's changed very much."
"That's all you know,"
sniffed the head demon.
"There is more than one prophecy about the fate of a Snake Lord, and you altered it the second you set the heir of Gryffindor free."
Draco swiveled his head around and looked at Harry, who appeared to be as nonplussed as he was. "But we killed the Manticore. Slytherin has the orb now, and since he's been preparing for the ritual all day, won't that mean that his life spark will be released soon?"
"That part of the prophecy has not changed,"
the demon said coldly. "What about the part where he has to offer up a legit heir who has Slytherin blood so he can keep that sword?" Harry put in. "Does that part still stand?" The demon nodded. "Bugger," Harry replied with feeling.
"Slytherin must be made to give up the sword with his own hand, or else we will be forced to take whomever he sets up in his place,"
said the demon.
"We want the sword. It is our right to hold it, and our obligation is to claim it. We have no use for the jinx, and do not want you or your friend."
Harry looked over at Draco, who now had his arms crossed. "If you have no use for Majids, then why do you want Slytherin?" he demanded. The demon grinned, showing 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth.
"Vengeance,"
it said.
"He cheated us. In hell, his torments will be excruciating and very extensive."
"Good," said Draco, nodding. "You know," said Harry suddenly, "you look a lot like the demon that attacked me in the woods. Small, rather striking fellow with no ears."
"You mean Straglandir,"
said the demon.
"Yes. He returned and informed us that his attempt to warn you about Slytherin's intent was unsuccessful."
"Is that what that was?" Harry asked, the demon's cryptic warning about him dying suddenly taking on a new context. "Well, you might want to tell him to say the most important part out loud first, before he goes leaping about and frightening people." The demon looked annoyed.
"It is not our fault that you humans have not the least sense to listen before you act."
"And it isn't my fault that every time someone strange shows up, I have to assume that they are there to kill me," Harry snapped, equally annoyed. "Anyway," Draco interjected, as he could tell that Harry was building up a head of steam, and he didn't want the other boy to royally piss off the demons, and they'd be forced to fight them, or some other inconvenient action. What are you lot here for? He demanded instead.
We're here to offer you a bargain,
said the demon. A bargain? That's funny, Draco said, half under his breath. He knew from his father that it was a very bad idea to make bargains with demons, or bargains with anyone. In fact, Malfoys don't bargain was one of the Malfoy family rules, and yet, wasn't that how his father had died? Torn to pieces by a demon? He sighed and pressed on. What kind of bargain? The demon smiled and produced a heavily rolled bit of parchment, the print of which was so small that Draco imagined ants would have had a hard time reading the text. The demonic signature at the bottom was inflamed, and next to it was Slytherin's own black seal.
This states that, in exchange for the boon your mother granted our fellow, we have agreed to grant you one opportunity to fulfill this bargain in the manner of your choice.
Draco blinked. He had no idea what his mother had to do with any of this, but decided that asking such a question might annoy the demon again. So, instead he said, "So, if we are able to get Slytherin to give you the sword with his own hand, will you be summoned to take him?"
"Immediately,"
said the demon.
"Of course, if he controls the orb before such a return occurs, we will be forced to take our sacrifice as he offers it. Either your blood, or the other Gryffindors."
"It's a deal," said Draco, before Harry could think of protesting. The demon, meanwhile, was raising its hand and gestured towards the wall. The dark opening appeared there again, as it had for Slytherin, and they vanished through it, without even so much as a pop to lessen the eeriness. Whew, and that is all for this chapter, guys. I may be a tiny chimney sweep, but I've got an enormous broom. The lyrics are by Rave, who I believe was a friend of Cassandra's. Quotes. "And behold my success" is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. "It does in the eyes of everyone with eyes" is from Red Dwarf. Anyway, guys, be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I have a Patreon where I have bonus content and also a Ko-fi if you would rather support me that way instead, if you have no interest in Patreon sweet treats. So anyway, guys, I've been talking for 2 hours, so I'm going to leave off here. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.